There are towns that forget a woman the moment she stops being useful.
And one that had already decided she was worth nothing. She had learned not to look up too fast. But today, something made her look. He had ridden off that ridge for one reason. And she was standing behind that counter.
The bell above the door of Calloway's General Supply had rung 1,000 times, and Nora Calloway had learned to read a man's business by the way he crossed the threshold. Farmers came in tired, their boots leaving red dust on the plank floor, their eyes already tallying what they could afford against what they needed. Ranch hands came in loud, filling the narrow aisles with their elbows and their noise. Traveling salesmen came in smooth, with their hats already off and their smiles already arranged. And Preston Doyle came in the way he did everything, like the room had been waiting there for him and the wait had been an honor. He was 24 years old and had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. His father owned the only bank in Willow Creek, which in 1882 meant his father owned most of Willow Creek in one form or another, and Preston had absorbed that fact the way a man absorbs the weather, not as something he'd earned, but as something that simply was, like altitude or longitude. He came through the door on a Tuesday morning in October with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his eyes already moving around the store with that particular kind of looking that isn't really looking at all. It was accounting, pricing things, deciding what was worth his attention and what wasn't. Nora was behind the counter with the ledger open, running a column of freight invoices against the store's receiving log. She didn't look up. She'd learned young that looking up too fast at Preston Doyle was an invitation. She finished the column first. "Calloway," he said, leaning both palms flat on the counter the way men did when they wanted to establish that the counter belonged to them. "You're looking industrious this morning. What can I get you, Preston?" It wasn't a question. She'd been making it not a question for years, flattening the end of it until it had no room for him to build on. Two women near the fabric bolts covered their mouths. Mrs. Garrett and her sister-in-law, who had come in for calico and stayed for whatever this was going to become. They'd been finding reasons to witness Nora Calloway's humiliation since she was 15 and taller than every boy in the schoolhouse. They had attended, in their quiet way, everyone. The day she turned down Reuben Miller and the Miller family stopped trading at the store. The day she sat alone at the county harvest social while every other girl her age was walked home by someone. The day Reverend Webb's wife said within earshot of half the congregation that it was a shame about the Calloway girl, so capable and yet. They were here now. They were always here now. "I need that music box wrapped," Preston said, nodding toward the glass case beside the window. "The rosewood one. Wedding gift." Nora set down her pencil. She knew whose wedding. Everyone knew. Harriet Blythe, 17 years old and soft as new butter, was marrying the Garrison boy come Saturday, and the whole county had been invited except the woman standing behind this counter. "Congratulations to the happy couple," Nora said, and she crossed to the case and lifted the music box out and set it on the wrapping paper and reached for the ribbon. And her hands did not shake, which she counted privately as a victory. "You ever think about it," Preston said, watching her work, "how it's always somebody else's wedding you're wrapping presents for?" "Preston." Her father's voice came from the back room, thin and warning. Henry Calloway was a good man with a heart that had started skipping beats 2 winters ago and lungs that rattled when the morning was cold. He did not have the wind in him for a fight, but he had enough left to say a name in a certain way, and he said Preston's now the way you say the name of a dog that's come too close to the table. "Just making conversation, Mr. Calloway." Preston didn't look toward the back. He kept his eyes on Nora. "My cousin Harlan was asking after her, matter of fact. Asked me, isn't there a Calloway girl of marrying age? Smart one, keeps her father's shop." He paused, letting the shape of what he was about to say take form in the air between them. "And I had to tell him the truth. I said there is. But she's the last option in this whole county, and a man doesn't reach for the last option." The store went quiet the way a church goes quiet before a difficult sermon. "Not even," he said, and he leaned forward the last inch, grinning, "not even for free." Mrs. Garrett made a small sound behind her glove. Nora set the ribbon down. She straightened her spine, one notch at a time, the way a person straightens a fence post, slow and deliberate and without any drama, because the drama was his and she would not take it from him. She looked Preston Doyle dead in the eye. "Say it again," she said. "Say it to my face." Something moved in Preston's expression, a flicker. He hadn't expected her to stand up into it. People rarely did, which was why he kept doing it, the expectation that they would fold, that the folding was the point. "I said," he repeated, slower and with more weight behind it, "no man in this county would take the last option. Not even for free." Nora slid the wrapped music box across the counter until its edge touched his knuckles. "Then it's a good thing," she said, "that I never asked." And behind Preston Doyle, the bell above the door rang. It rang different. Or maybe it only seemed different because everyone in the store turned at once. The two women by the fabric, old Mr. Pelham sitting with his coffee near the window, her father's shadow falling still in the doorway to the back, all of them turning toward the sound the way people turn toward something they can feel before they can see. The man who filled the doorway filled it entirely, broad through the shoulders. A black hat that he did not take off, which meant he hadn't come to be social. Boots that had serious miles on them. He held the door open with one gloved hand and stood there for a moment with the cold October morning at his back. And he looked at Nora, not at Preston, not at the women by the calico, not around the store the way men looked around a store when they were deciding what they wanted. At Nora, Mrs. Garrett's sister-in-law actually gasped. A small sound involuntary, the kind a woman makes when the most consequential man in the territory walks into a room she happens to be occupying. Ethan Mercer. Everyone in Willow Creek knew the name, and almost no one had ever spoken to the man. He owned Mercer Ridge, 40,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the Colorado Territory, more cattle than any one person could count in a working day, and a house on the hill so large that children invented stories about the rooms in it. He had buried his wife 3 years ago in the autumn and had not been seen at a church supper, a county social, or a Sunday service since. He came to town for business and left before the dust from his horse had fully settled. Every mother in the valley with a daughter of suitable age had been laying traps for him for 3 years and catching nothing but air. And now he was standing in Callaway's General Supply, and he was looking at Nora, Mr. Mercer. Preston snatched his hat off his head so fast he nearly knocked it across the floor. "Sir, I didn't. Is there something I can?" Ethan Mercer did not look at Preston Doyle. He stepped inside, and his boots were loud on the plank floor in the silence, and he crossed the full length of the store past the flour barrels and the coils of rope and the bins of nails, and the 2 women who had stopped pretending to look at fabric, and he stopped at the counter. He looked at Nora the way a man looks at something he has come a deliberate distance to see. "Miss Callaway," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that the room would quiet itself for him and had stopped trying to fill it. Nora's mouth was dry. "Yes, sir. You'd be Henry's daughter." "The one who runs his accounts." "I would be. The one who caught the Overland Freight Company overcharging this county 2 winters back. Wrote the letter that got the rates rolled back." The store made no sound at all. Nora had done that. She had spent 3 weeks with the invoices and the freight tables in November of 1880, cross-referencing rate schedules against delivery receipts, and she had found it, a systematic overcharge on every shipment to Willow Creek and 4 surrounding towns, small enough per invoice to seem like rounding error, large enough across 500 invoices to constitute something considerably more deliberate. She had written a letter so precisely worded, so thoroughly documented, that the Overland Company had folded rather than fight it and refunded 7 months of overcharges to the entire valley. Her father had told her not to make trouble. The town had said nothing at all. She had filed the correspondence away and gone back to the ledger and assumed the whole business was forgotten. "I did write that letter," she said. Ethan Mercer nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he had already decided before he walked through the door. Then he turned his head, just his head, and looked at Preston Doyle for the first time. Preston went the color of old cream. "You were saying something when I came in," Ethan said, "about the last option." "That was." Preston's voice came out wrong, too high, and he cleared his throat and tried again. It was only talk, Mr. Mercer. Between fun," Ethan said. He let the word sit in the room by itself for a moment. "That how you talk to a woman who runs a business better than your father runs his bank." Nobody breathed. Preston opened his mouth. He closed it. He was 24 years old and had never once in his life been made to feel the full weight of his own smallness, and the sensation was apparently paralyzing. "Go on home, son," Ethan said quietly. "Take your gift, and your fun." Preston Doyle took his wrapped music box. He went. He did not slam the door because you did not slam a door on Ethan Mercer, and the bell rang its small, diminished ring behind him. Mrs. Garrett and her sister-in-law discovered a sudden urgent interest in a bolt of brown wool, and very carefully did not look at anything that was happening near the counter. Ethan turned back to Nora. And here was the thing she would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward. His face changed. Not soft, exactly. There was nothing soft about Ethan Mercer, and she understood instinctively that softness wasn't something that lived in him in any simple way. But something behind his eyes eased. A particular tension that a man carries in his jaw and his shoulders when he has been braced against something for a very long time. It shifted. Not gone. Shifted. Like a man setting down a weight he'd forgotten he was carrying. "I've come to offer you work, Miss Callaway." Nora heard the words and understood them and did not move. "Work," she said. "At the Ridge. I have 20 years of ranch records in a condition that would make a bookkeeper weep. Ledgers, land deeds, cattle counts, water rights agreements my father signed before I was old enough to read them, none of it in any order a reasonable person could follow. My foreman can rope a steer blind in a windstorm, but he can't add a column of figures. My last man for the books quit in the spring and went to Denver." He paused. "I need someone who can look at a mess and see the shape underneath it. I'm told that's you." From the back room, Henry Callaway's cane tapped the floor as he made his way slowly forward. He appeared in the doorway, his breath already whistling from the effort of crossing the room, his eyes moving from his daughter to the man at the counter, with an expression that was trying to contain too many things at once. "Mr. Mercer," Henry said, that's a generous offer, a real generous offer. But my Nora, she's needed here." The store doesn't. I'm not the man I was, and she's $40 a month, Ethan said. The store made a sound, not a word. A sound involuntary and collective, the sound of a room recalibrating. Mrs. Garrett dropped her wool. $40 a month was more than the schoolteacher made. It was more than most men in Willow Creek cleared in 30 days of hard work. It was a number that didn't belong in this room, spoken to this woman, in this context. Henry Calloway lowered himself onto the stool beside the till. His hands were not steady. I'll send a man down 3 days a week to help in the store, Ethan continued, still looking at Nora. So you're not left short-handed on my account, Mr. Calloway. He set a card on the counter, thick, cream stock, the Mercer Ridge brand pressed into the corner like a seal. That's the offer. You can say no. I won't ask twice and I won't hold it against you, but I won't pretend I have a second name on my list. His eyes held hers. It's you or it's nobody, Miss Calloway. And I'd rather it was you. It's you or it's nobody. Not 10 minutes ago in this same square of floor, she had been told that no man in the county would choose her even for nothing. And now the most consequential man in the Colorado Territory was standing in that same spot and telling her she was the only choice worth making. Her mind went to the number and turned it over the way she turned over a freight bill that came in looking too clean. Men did not do this. Rich men especially did not do this. There was a hook in it somewhere. There had to be. Why me, she said. Ethan tilted his head slightly. I told you why. You told me what? What you need and what you'll pay. You didn't tell me why. She kept her voice level and her hands still on the counter. There are certified bookkeepers in Denver who would take the morning train for $40 a month. There are men with credentials and references. You could hire any of them. She looked at him steadily. So I'll ask you plain, Mr. Mercer, since plain is how I do things. Why did you ride off that ridge and come to a supply store to ask for a woman by name? Behind her, she heard Mrs. Garrett whisper something. The nerve of her, just loud enough to carry. Ethan Mercer did not get angry. He did not look past her or through her or around her the way men looked when a woman said something they hadn't expected and didn't know how to file. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, exactly. But the country a smile comes from. You just did it, he said. The thing I'm paying for. Somebody hands you a considerable offer and you don't reach for it. You turn it over first. You look underneath. You ask the questions out loud in front of witnesses, even when the careful thing would be to take the money and say thank you. He nodded once. I have 20 years of records, Miss Calloway. And I have believed for some time that at least one man I have trusted has been helping himself to what isn't his. For years, carefully, in a way that nobody has been able to prove. He paused. I don't need someone who will flatter me or tell me what I want to hear. I need someone who will ask the hard question out loud, even when it's uncomfortable. You're the first person in 3 years who has done it to my face. He picked up his hat. Think on it. You want the work. You come up to the ridge Monday. You don't. He touched the brim of the hat. I'll trouble you no further. He nodded to Henry, Mr. Calloway. And then he was gone, boots deliberate on the planks, the bell ringing once, the cold morning swallowing him, and the door swinging shut behind him. The store stayed quiet for several seconds. Then Henry Calloway, sitting on his stool with his hands on his knees, exhaled a long and careful breath. Nora, he said, which was what he called her when something had gotten past all his other words. Nora, girl. She was looking at the card on the counter. The Mercer Ridge brand was a clean, simple mark, an M with a ridge line through it, pressed deep into the cream stock. I know, Pa, $40. I know. Do you know what that means for us? For the note on the store? For the doctor, a real doctor, not Pruitt with his tonic water, Pa. She came around the counter and put her hand on his shoulder and felt how thin it had gotten. She'd been watching that happen all winter and telling herself it was the cut of his shirt. Sit back, breathe first. We'll talk about it sensibly. But there was no time to talk about it sensibly because the bell rang again 20 minutes later, and then again, because by 2 in the afternoon, every soul in Willow Creek had found a reason to visit Calloway's General Supply. Widow Grayson came in for thread she did not need. Is it true? She said, barely through the door. $40? To go up to that house alone? Oh, Nora, honey, your reputation. My reputation, Nora said. Weighing out thread the woman hadn't asked for has been this town's favorite subject for 10 years. I don't imagine there's much of it left to protect. Mrs. Garrett came back with her sister-in-law and her mother, all three of them arranged into expressions of tremendous concern. We only mean it kindly, Mrs. Garrett said. A man like Mr. Mercer and a girl in your position, people will draw conclusions. You know how people are. People drew conclusions this morning while you were standing at my fabric counter, Nora said pleasantly. I noticed that didn't stop you from staying to hear them. Mrs. Garrett's mouth went tight as a closed coin purse. Reverend Aldous Webb came in the late afternoon, turning his hat in both hands, his face set in the particular arrangement of a man who believes he is about to do someone a kindness they will not enjoy receiving. Nora, he said, settling into the chair by the cold stove. I don't wish to add to your burdens, but I'd be failing my office if I didn't ask plainly. He looked at his hat. What could a man of his means and his solitude want with the daughter of a shopkeeper, if not something a Christian woman ought not provide? That one landed differently, because Reverend Webb said it gently, and gentleness, when it's cutting the same direction as cruelty, has a sharper edge. Nora set down her pencil. "Reverend," she said, "you've known me since I was in short skirts. Have I, in all that time, done one thing I was ashamed of?" He considered it honestly. "No," he admitted, "you have not." "Then trust me to know the difference between an honest wage and a shameful one." She let a moment pass. "He wants his books put in order, that is all. And the Lord knows I can put books in order. If this whole county has decided my mind is the only thing about me worth anything, well, here's a man willing to pay $40 a month for it. It seems to me the county might be wrong about the worth of the thing." Reverend Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and set his hat back on his head. "You were always the sharpest mind in my Sunday school," he said quietly. "It shames me that it took Ethan Mercer to remind this town of it. He left. He was the only one all day who left having said something true and meant it as kindness." That night, after the store was shut and her father was in bed with his medicine, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the cream-colored card in front of her and the household ledger open beside it, and she did what she always did when her heart wanted one thing and the practical world wanted to account for every other thing. She did the arithmetic. $40 a month, $480 a year. The note on the store, which she had been juggling for 2 years, moving money from the supply account to cover it, moving it back, holding the whole leaning structure upright through a combination of careful timing and sheer force of will, while her father's lungs grew worse and the doctor bills from Pruitt grew longer and less useful. She knew to the penny how far behind they were, because she was the one who had always known to the penny. $40 a month would fix it. Not eventually, quickly. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. And then Henry Calloway appeared in the bedroom doorway in his nightshirt, holding the frame, his breath making its quiet whistle in the cold. "Pa," she said, "you should be sleeping. I heard you thinking." He came and lowered himself into the chair across from her, slow and careful, the way he did everything now. For a while he said nothing. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire settling and his breathing. "Your mother would have known the right words," he said finally. "She always did." His eyes were wet at the corners. "I don't. I've never been good at this part. I've watched this town treat you hard for years, Nora, and I never—" His voice broke at the edge of something. "I was tired. I was sick and tired, and I let them. A father ought to have run off the cruelty, or at least made sure his daughter knew she was worth choosing. Every day. I should have said it every day." He put his thin hand over hers on the table. "And now a man I've never spoken 3 words to rides down off a mountain and tells you in 5 minutes what I should have been telling you for 27 years. His hand tightened over hers. "You take the work, Nora. Not for the note, not for the doctor. You take it because a man looked at you today, a serious man, a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean, and he saw what I see, and by God, you deserve to be seen." Nora Calloway, who had not cried when Preston Doyle called her worthless in her own store, who had not cried when the Reverend questioned her virtue or the Garrett women pitied her out loud, put her face down against her father's thin hand and wept. She took the work. Monday morning, before the sun had fully risen, she put on her plainest and most durable dress. Not to be modest, but because she was going up the mountain to work, and a working woman dressed accordingly. She pinned her hair back without ceremony. She borrowed the Henderson family's old roan mare, because the walk to Mercer Ridge was the better part of 2 hours on foot. She rode up the long road as the sky went from black to gray to the particular pale gold of an October morning in the Colorado high country, and she did not look back at the town below, though she knew it was watching. The road climbed steadily. The higher she went, the more the ranch spread out below her, and she began to understand in a way that the numbers had not quite conveyed exactly what 40,000 acres looked like from the middle of them. Cattle in every direction, unhurried and various. Fences running to horizons she couldn't locate. Barns built for function on a scale that made the Willow Creek Church look temporary. And at the summit, the house. Not the fairy tale mansion the children described in their schoolyard stories, but something larger and plainer and more serious than that. Big enough to hold 20 people comfortably. Empty enough that you could feel the one person rattling around inside it from 50 yards away. A ranch hand took her horse at the gate with a nod and no conversation. The woman who answered the door was iron-haired and iron-faced and looked at Nora with the evaluating stillness of someone who had made assessments of people her entire life and was not prepared to be hurried into this one. "Miss Calloway," the woman said. "Not a question." "That's right, Nora Calloway." A beat of silence. "Cordelia Crane. I keep this house." She stepped back. "Mr. Mercer's out at the north pasture. He said to put you in the study and let you start." She turned and walked, and Nora understood she was meant to follow. He said, "Don't hover." "I've been hovering people my entire professional life, and I don't intend to stop." But he said it anyway. A look back over her shoulder, assessing, "You'll want coffee." Everyone who goes into that room wants coffee within the hour. It's the state of it. The study was worse than Ethan Mercer had described. 20 years of a working ranch, and before that, the years of his father's working ranch, had gone into this room and never come back out. Ledgers stacked to the windowsills, loose deeds and contracts stuffed into drawers and pasteboard boxes, and in one case she would discover later, a boot. Cattle tallies written on the backs of letters, tobacco tins packed with receipts, a full shelf of correspondence that had never been organized into so much as a rough chronological pile. It was chaos. It was the accumulated disorder of 2 generations, and any reasonable bookkeeper with other options would have taken one look and gone back down the mountain. Nora Calloway looked at it, and something in her chest eased. Because here at last was a problem the size of her. Here was a thing that needed exactly what she had and nothing she didn't. And there was no one in this room to whisper behind their hand or laugh behind their glove or question what a woman was doing here. There were only numbers waiting to be read. "Mrs. Crane," she said, taking off her shawl and rolling up her sleeves. "I believe I will have that coffee." She worked. She started with the ledgers because the ledgers were the spine of the operation, the record that everything else was meant to support. She laid them out across the desk and the floor in chronological order, year by year, and she began to read the story of Mercer Ridge in the language she had spoken more fluently than English since she was 9 years old. She read the lean years and the fat ones. She read the year Ethan's father died, the handwriting changing midway through a quarter, going shaky and uncertain for 6 months before steadying into something younger and more deliberate. A young man learning to carry what had been set on him. She read the hard winter of 4 years back when the losses bled red across 3 pages. She read the careful expansions and the cautious contractions of a man who understood that 40,000 acres was not a gift but a responsibility. And she read something else. She almost missed it. Real thieving is always small, small enough to hide inside the ordinary bleeding of a large operation, small enough to look like rounding error or market variation or the simple inefficiency that any enterprise accumulates over time. But Nora had spent years reading numbers for their irregularities, and her eye caught on a pattern the way a hook catches on cloth. A small resistance, a snag, something that stopped the smooth movement of her attention and would not let go. Feed purchases. The feed purchases did not move with the cattle counts. In good years, when the herd was up and healthy, the feed expenditure was higher than it should have been. In bad years, the hard winter, the dry summer of 1879, when headcount dropped and animals died, the feed costs did not drop with them. They held. In one quarter they climbed. Fewer mouths, more feed. The numbers insisted on it, page after page, year after year. Somebody was purchasing feed for animals that no longer existed, or purchasing feed that never arrived, or recording feed purchases to move money somewhere the ledger wasn't following. She was still bent over 3 open ledgers, her finger tracing the same wrong line across 4 years when she heard boots in the hallway. She looked up. Ethan Mercer stood in the doorway of his own study with his hat in his hand, watching her. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His face was unreadable in the careful way of a man who has had reasons to make it so. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. Nora straightened up. Her back ached from bending. There was ink on her fingers and she suspected some on her face, and her hair had come half down from its pins and she did not care about any of it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "who purchases your feed?" Something moved across his face, not surprise. Something more like confirmation, the look of a man watching a thing arrive that he had been both hoping and dreading in equal measure. "Tell me what you mean by that. Your feed, your grain, your hay, your winter forage. Who places the order, who records the receipt, and who pays the invoice? Because if it's 3 different people, I need to talk to all 3 of them. And if it's one," she put her ink-stained finger on the open ledger, on the line that did not move the way it should, "then I believe I know why you told me on Friday that you suspected someone you trusted had been robbing you. Because it's right here, Mr. Mercer. It has been right here for years, and I don't believe a single soul in this room before today has ever read it." Ethan Mercer came slowly across the study. He set his hat on the corner of the desk and leaned over the ledger where her finger rested, close enough that she could smell the cold air and the horses and the outdoors on him, and he read the line she was pointing to. He read it again. "Say it plain," he said very quietly, "the way you said it to that boy in your father's store." Nora looked up at him, at the hard, careful face gone suddenly sharp, the jaw set, the eyes that had eased that morning in the store gone dangerous now in a way that was not directed at her. "Someone has been stealing from you, Mr. Mercer," she said. "They have been doing it since before your father died, and they are still doing it right now." For a long moment he did not move. His jaw worked. His hand on the desk beside hers closed slowly into a fist. 3 years, he said. 3 years my own men have been telling me the books are fine. The Denver man I brought in said they were fine. My creditors, my foreman, everyone. He said the last word like he was testing its weight and finding it hollow. Fine. He turned and looked at her, and there was something raw in his face now, something that Willow Creek had never seen and would not have known how to account for if it had. "You have been here one day," he said. "I have been reading numbers my whole life," Nora said, "on account of no one would let me do much else." And Ethan Mercer laughed. It came out of him rough and startled, the way a sound comes when it has been waiting behind a door that hasn't opened in a long time and has to break something small to get through. He put his hand over his face and he laughed, and when he took his hand away, the hardness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The same ease she had seen that morning in the store, but deeper now, and more surprised by itself. Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway with a look of unconcealed alarm. Mrs. Crane, Ethan said, still steadying himself. Miss Calloway is going to want a great deal more coffee. He looked at Nora and the laugh faded, but whatever had come with it remained. The look of a man who has been going under slowly for a long time and has just felt solid ground underfoot. She and I are going to sit in this room, and she is going to show me every place I've been robbed. And then the hardness came back into his voice, clear and cold and purposeful, but it wasn't aimed at her. Then somebody is going to answer for it. Nora turned back to the ledgers. "Pull up a chair, Mr. Mercer," she said. "This is going to take a while, and you're going to want to be sitting down." He pulled up a chair, and down in Willow Creek, where gossip traveled faster than horses, and always had, the whispers were already moving from house to house about the last option and the richest man in the county, alone together in a house on the ridge. They didn't know about the ledgers. They didn't know about the thief hiding in plain sight inside 20 years of paperwork. They didn't know that up on that mountain, for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Mercer had laughed. Or that the woman the whole town had decided was worthless had just made herself the single most important person on 40,000 acres. They only knew what they always knew, which was nothing, and they said it loud the way small places do. But Nora Calloway was done listening to them. She had numbers to read, she had a father to save, she had a thief to find, and she had a man sitting across a desk from her who had looked at her mind and called it valuable when the whole world had called it inconvenient. She dipped her pen. "Let's start with the feed," she said. They started with the feed, and by the end of the second hour, Nora had a number. She didn't say it out loud yet. She had learned young that a number was a thing you could prove, and a name was a thing that got you called a liar. So she built the number first, the way a mason builds a wall, one course at a time, each piece locked to the one beneath it, nothing left to the goodwill of the person listening. She laid 3 ledgers side by side across the desk and ran her finger down the columns while Ethan sat across from her and watched her hands move with the focused stillness of a man who has spent his life reading weather and animals and terrain and has now found something new worth reading. "Winter of 1879, she said. "The hard year." "You lost how many head?" "Close to 400. His voice was flat with the memory of it. "Worst cold I'd ever seen come through this valley. Animals dead in the snow before we could get to them. And your feed expenditure, that quarter went up." "Silence! Show me!" She turned the ledger toward him and set her finger on the line. He leaned forward and read it. He read it again. "How much?" he said very quietly. "Over the full run of it." Nora looked at the tally sheet she'd been building on a clean page beside the open ledgers. "I need another day to be certain, but my current figure is somewhere near $200 per quarter, every quarter. For at least 4 years." She let the number stand on its own for a moment. "That is more than $3,000 I can account for. The records become difficult to read clearly before 1878. It may go back further." The room held the number the way a room holds a sound after the source of it has stopped. Ethan stood up. The chair scraped hard across the floor, and he walked to the window and stood with his back to her, his fist pressed against the frame, looking out at the ridge that bore his name and his father's name before him. Nora let him stand there. She understood that stillness. It was not confusion. It was a man doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with money, adding up every handshake, every shared meal, every year of assumed loyalty, and finding the sum of it false. "Who handles the feed accounts?" he said without turning around. "Tell me to confirm it. You tell me first. Then I'll tell you if the record agrees." He turned. His jaw was set in a way that aged him and made him look, for just a moment, like the young man he must have been when he took this ranch over, braced for the weight of a thing he couldn't yet measure. "Douglas Hale," he said. "My father hired him 30 years ago. He handles all purchasing, feed, seeds, supply, freight arrangements. Trusted him with the checkbook when I was still learning to read a balance sheet." Something moved through his expression that was not quite grief and not quite fury and was perhaps what lives between the two. "He carried my father's coffin, Miss Calloway." Nora looked down at the ledger so he wouldn't have to watch her face while he heard the rest. "Then I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer, because the handwriting in these feed entries matches the hand in this letter." She slid a piece of correspondence across the desk, a supply order she had found folded inside a tobacco tin, signed at the bottom in a large looping script. "Hale, the amounts on the orders don't match the amounts in the book. He orders one figure, he records another. The difference doesn't go to the ranch." Ethan took the letter. He read the signature of a man he had known his entire life. And Nora watched something close behind his eyes. Not all at once, but in the way a door closes when the wind takes it, slowly and then with finality. "My wife didn't like him," he said. The words came out carefully, like he was carrying them across uncertain ground. "Catherine," she said, her eyes has never settled on anything. "I told her she was being uncharitable." He set the letter down with a deliberateness that was almost worse than anger. "She's been gone 3 years, and I'm still finding out she was right." Before Nora could answer, Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway. The housekeeper's closed, weathered face had opened into something Nora hadn't seen from the woman yet. Unguarded worry, the expression of someone who has managed a household long enough to know when the ground is about to shift under it. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was careful. "Douglas Hale just rode into the yard." Says he heard you took on a bookkeeper and he's come to make her welcome. Her mouth thinned to a line. He's got that smile on. Ethan and Nora looked at each other across the desk full of the man's own thieving. Nora felt her pulse quicken, and she made herself breathe through it, slow and even. There was no time now for the careful chapter-by-chapter presentation she had been building. The thief was in the yard, and he was coming up smiling, which meant he was worried enough to come in person, which meant he had already heard something that concerned him, which meant there was a version of this morning where everything she had built fell apart before she could finish it. "He can't know what I've found," she said, low and fast. "Not yet. If he suspects, he'll cover it. He'll adjust the books overnight, destroy the orders, move whatever he needs to move. I need 2 more days with the freight receipts to make the case airtight. Every number locked to every other number. Nothing he can argue away. You want me to sit across from Douglas Hale and give nothing away?" Ethan's voice was very controlled. "Knowing what's in that ledger, I want you to buy me 2 days." She was already moving, stacking the incriminating ledgers, sliding the supply order under a clean pile of correspondence, rearranging the desk into the appearance of innocent preliminary disorder. A woman's first bewildered morning among too many papers. "Can you do that, Mr. Mercer? Can you look a man in the eye who has been robbing you for 4 years and let him believe he's safe?" Ethan Mercer straightened, settled his hat on his head, and his face changed, not to anger, but to something colder and more controlled than anger. Something even. The face of a man who has been given a reason to be patient and intends to use it. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I have been keeping my own counsel for 3 years. Watch me work." Douglas Hale came through the front door the way he came everywhere, like a man who had a rightful share in the place and was only being modest about claiming it. Nora heard him before she saw him, a big rolling voice, warm and unhurried, the kind that fills a room and makes the room feel better for it. "Ethan, there you are." Heard the whole county's talking. The voice came closer down the hallway. "Say you rode down to Willow Creek and hired yourself the Calloway girl. The one keeps old Henry's store." A pause theatrical in its concern. "Now that's a kindness, it is. Sweet girl, I'm sure. But you should have come to me first. I'd have found you a proper man from Denver, certified experience, someone who knows what he's looking at." He filled the study doorway, and Nora understood at once why he had never been caught. He was likable. Genuinely, disarmingly, completely likable. 60 years old, broad and solid, white whiskers neat against his jaw, eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The face of a grandfather in a painting, the hands of a man who had done real work. There was nothing in his appearance that invited suspicion. Everything about him said, trusted, known, safe. If she had not spent the morning reading the truth in his own numbers, she would have liked him herself. "Miss Calloway." He came toward her with his hand extended, both eyes warm, the smile reaching all of his face. "Douglas Hale. I handle the purchasing up here, feed and supply, freight arrangements. Been keeping the Mercer family's affairs going on 30 years. He took her hand and held it in both of his, a grandfatherly clasp. "So you and I will be working close, I expect. You get lost in these books, and you will. Honey, that's no shame. 20 years of a working ranch is no small thing. You come to old Douglas. I'll set you straight." Nora looked into that warm, crinkling, careful face, and she smiled back with every ounce of the harmlessness she had spent the morning assembling. "That's so kind, Mr. Hale. I confess I'm already turned around. So much paper and no clear starting point. I don't imagine I'll make sense of half of it. Don't you fret." He patted her hand. "Truth told, it's a man's kind of work. No shame in finding it too much. You just tidy the correspondence and the like. Leave the hard accounts to someone who's lived with them 30 years. She felt Ethan go rigid at her shoulder. She pressed her heel down on the toe of his boot, firmly, without looking at him. He held. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear," she said warmly. "What a relief." Hale beamed, and Nora watched the relief move through him. Small, quick, buried deep under the smile. But there he had ridden up that road worried. He had found a confused girl playing helplessly among correspondence. He could ride down easy. Well, he released her hand and turned to Ethan, all comfort and goodwill. "Glad to see you taking care of things, son. You let me know if there's anything I can help orient her to. These books are my life's work, near enough. I know where everything lives." He clapped Ethan's shoulder with the ease of a man who had been doing it for decades. "Anything you need." "Appreciate it, Douglas," Ethan said, and his voice was level and his face was still, and it cost him something. Nora could see it costing him, but he held it. "Always do." Hale left the way he had come, unhurried, warm, entirely satisfied. The sound of his horse leaving the yard came to them through the study window, and Nora stood listening until the hoofbeats faded entirely. Then Ethan Mercer let out a breath that shook at its edges. 30 years, he said. He called me son. Stood there and told you to leave the hard accounts to him, because he's the only one who can read them. He pressed his hand flat against the desk, and the only reason he's the only one who can read them is that he made them unreadable. On purpose. The understanding kept arriving, layer after layer, each one heavier than the last. That's why the books were always a mess, Ethan said. Not carelessness, not incompetence. He kept them chaotic deliberately so no one could ever follow the thread. He looked at Nora, and she watched the full weight of it come home to him. How much of this ranch has that man arranged? The feed and supply, Nora said carefully, but also the freight contracts, the creditor relationships. You said he hired hands? Half the men on this property came through Douglas Hale. Something shifted in Ethan's face. Not panic, but the particular clearness of a man who has just seen the actual size of a problem he thought was smaller. If I move against him, some of those men are his. I don't know which ones, but some of them will be. Then we don't move against him yet, Nora said. We move carefully and we move completely. And when we do move, the numbers will be so thoroughly proved that not one man on this ridge will be able to stand up and call it a mistake. She met his eyes. But I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Mercer, the moment I finish these books, Douglas Hale is going to realize he has something to fear. And men who are afraid do things that go beyond ledgers. Ethan looked at her steadily. You want to walk away from it, now's the time. I'll pay the full month and no complaint. This isn't what I hired you for. Nora thought of the note on the store. She thought of her father's breathing. She thought of Preston Doyle's face that morning, and the years of Mrs. Garrett's glove pressed over her laughing mouth, and the whole long story of being told she was worth less than she was. She thought of those crooked numbers in that ledger, and the way her finger had stopped on the line that didn't move right, and the feeling of a thing finally being the size of her. Mr. Mercer, she said, go ahead and try to get rid of me. I dare you. He looked at her for a moment. Then, for the second time that day, he laughed. The days that followed were the hardest and the most alive Nora Calloway had ever spent, and they moved with the particular speed of days that matter. She let it be known, loudly and cheerfully, that she was drowning in correspondence and expected to be at it for months, poor overwhelmed creature. And she allowed Hale's man, Silas Taft, newly hired, installed in the yard under the pretext of being a distant relation in need of work, to see her apparently lost among the letters whenever he brought the coffee or laid the study fire. She performed bewilderment with the same precision she brought to everything else, and Taft carried his observations back to Douglas Hale like a man who believed he was useful. Behind the closed study door, Nora worked on the real case. Ethan sat with her most evenings. It had begun practically. He knew the operation, could identify names and dates and relationships that the ledgers only hinted at, and it did not stay practical. You never remarried, she said one evening, not looking up from a freight table. She had found it was easier to ask him direct things when her eyes were on the page. No, the whole county's been trying to arrange it for 3 years. The whole county's been trying to arrange a match for Mercer Ridge. That's a different thing. He was quiet for a moment. After Catherine, I couldn't take it seriously. Every widow and every well-meaning family that came calling, they were looking past me at the land the whole time. I could feel it. I'd rather be honestly alone than married to someone's calculation. Nora's pen stopped moving. Do you know what's strange? She said. That's almost exactly what people say about me, that I'm alone because I run calculations instead of being one. Ethan looked at her across the lamplight for a long moment. Maybe that's why I came down the mountain, Miss Calloway, he said quietly. One calculation to another. She put her eyes back on the page. Her heart did something she told it firmly to stop doing, and it did not listen. Vivian Ashford arrived on a Wednesday. Nora heard the name first from Mrs. Crane, who delivered it one morning while laying the study fire with slightly more force than the task required. Vivian Ashford's come back to the valley, the housekeeper said, setting the poker down against the grate. Took the old Ashford place. Came in on Tuesday's train with 4 trunks and a girl to carry them. She kept her eyes on the fire. You'll want to know who that is. Tell me. Grew up here. Fine family. Fine money before the money went. Her and Catherine were girls together. Her and Catherine and Ethan, all 3 close when they were young. Mrs. Crane's jaw was tight in the particular way of a woman who has watched something happen slowly for a long time and has opinions about it that she will not quite say. Vivian set her cap for Ethan back then. Everybody knew it. Then Catherine got him instead, and Vivian married a rich man in Denver and moved away. She finally looked at Nora directly. That Denver husband died last winter, left her a widow, and now she's home, 3 years to the month after Catherine went into the ground. She picked up her basket and moved toward the door. You do the figures, Miss Calloway. I expect you'll find the sum unpleasant. Nora did the figures. They came out in a way she did not particularly enjoy. Vivian Ashford appeared at Mercer Ridge 2 days later in a hired carriage, with a card that said she had come to pay respects to a dear old friend in his grief. She was everything the figures had predicted. Beautiful in the way that money and care and 36 years of knowing exactly what she was doing had made her beautiful. Gowned appropriately. Gloved impeccably. Warm in a way that felt entirely natural until you looked at it from a slight angle and saw the architecture underneath. She took one measured look at Nora in the hallway and made her decision in approximately 2 seconds. Oh, she said, with a smile of genuine and generous warmth. You must be the bookkeeper, the girl from the little store in town. She pressed Nora's hand briefly. How good of Ethan to give you the work. He always did have a soft heart for people who needed a hand up. His Catherine was just the same. The smile held. You must let me know if the accounts get to be too much for you, dear. I ran my late husband's household finances for 15 years. Sometimes these things do require a particular kind of background. Nora smiled back. That's very kind. I'll be sure to come to you if I find anything beyond me. And she thought, with a coldness that surprised her, you have no idea what I'm capable of, and neither does the man you've come here for. But that was pride talking, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford to let herself spend, because the truth underneath it was something she liked considerably less. Vivian Ashford was beautiful. She had known Ethan since they were children. She had loved him before Catherine did. She belonged in this house in a way that was legible to everyone who looked at it. The right background, the right bearing, the right history. Nora Calloway, the last option from the supply store, did not belong here. She had been telling herself for 2 weeks that the evenings across the desk were only evenings across a desk. She had been telling her heart to keep to the columns. Neither effort had been entirely successful, and here now was the column's revenge, arriving in a hired carriage to remind her exactly what she was and was not. She was still sitting with that when Ethan came in that evening and found her working with her jaw set at an angle that was not about the freight tables. "Vivienne came by," he said. "Not a question. She did. She's lovely. She is. You've known her a long time. Since we were children. Her and me and Catherine." He came and sat on the corner of the desk closer than the work required, which was something he had been doing for a week without either of them naming it. "She was Catherine's friend once, then not. It's an old story and not a kind one." Nora made herself look up. Plain was how she did things, even when plain cost her. "She belongs in this house, Mr. Mercer. I've known it since the morning you offered me the work. Everyone in that town has been saying it for a month. And now a woman who is genuinely suited to this life has come home to prove them right." Her voice was steady, which took more effort than any column she had ever added. "I'm your bookkeeper. I'll finish what I started and I'll set your records straight. And then I'll go back to my father's store, where I belong. That's the honest sum of it." The study was quiet. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, rougher at the edges, like something had worn through a layer of it. "You know what I hate most about this county," he said. "It's that they taught you to do that, to look at yourself and put yourself at the bottom of the column before anyone else even has the chance." He stood up. "You caught a thief that 3 years of other people couldn't find. You've outmaneuvered a man who's been running a careful deception for decades. Mrs. Crane, who does not warm to people. I want you to understand what I mean when I say she does not warm to people, would walk through a closed door for you, and you sit here and tell me a woman with 4 trunks belongs in my house and you don't." He stopped himself. His jaw worked. "You want figures? Here is some. Vivian Ashford has been in this valley 3 days, and I have thought about her exactly as long as it took to read her calling card. You have been on this mountain 3 weeks, and I cannot get through an evening without needing to know what you think about something." He looked at her steadily. "Run that column. Tell me where it comes out." Nora's heart was doing something so loud she thought he must be able to hear it in the silence. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say things like that unless I mean them." He held her gaze. "Ask anyone in this territory. It is the one consistent thing they will all agree on about me." The lamplight held them both for one long, suspended moment. The study door open, the fire crackling, a ledger full of a thief's careful crimes lying open on the desk between them, and something else entirely building in the air above it. And then Mrs. Crane knocked twice and entered with a fresh pot of coffee and the information that one of the young hands had a question about the morning's rotation, and the moment dispersed into the practical world and did not reassemble in quite that form again. But it had been there. They both knew it had been there. 3 nights later, working alone while Ethan was at a far camp overnight, Nora went to the correspondence shelf for a freight receipt she needed to close a particular gap in the case. She had seen it on her second day. She had placed it in the 3rd box on the left. She had a mind like a ledger, and she did not misremember pages. The box was there. The receipt was not. Neither were 2 others. The specific 2 that linked Douglas Hale's ordering records to the freight company's delivery logs. The 2 that turned a pattern of suspicious numbers into a provable chain. Nora stood very still in the lamplight, with her heart beating hard and deliberate, the way it beat when she understood something she did not want to understand. She looked at the shelf. She looked at the box. She looked at the careful arrangement of everything else, undisturbed, innocent, exactly as she had left it. Someone had known which 3 receipts to take out of 20 years of paper. She thought of Silas Taft bringing the coffee. She thought of the study door that she had not been careful enough about closing. She thought of the particular way Taft always lingered a half-beat past the point of usefulness at the threshold, and she understood with cold precision that she had underestimated Douglas Hale. He had not ridden away easy. He had ridden away in thought. The door opened behind her and she spun, her hand going to the letter knife on the desk before she had consciously decided to reach for it, and it was Mrs. Crane who took in Nora's white face and the knife and shut the door behind her in one quiet motion. "What's happened?" "3 receipts are gone." Nora made herself set the knife down, "the 3 I needed most." "Mrs. Crane, who lays the fire in this room?" The housekeeper's weathered face went still in a way that answered the question before she spoke. "Silas Taft. Douglas brought him on 6 weeks ago. Said the boy was a relation who needed work." Her hand found the back of a chair. "He's been in here every morning, and he's been watching what I look at." Nora pressed her ink-stained fingers to her mouth and made herself think. A missing receipt was a gap, not a grave. She had built cases with gaps before. The freight company kept records of every delivery. The receipt she held was one half of a pair, and the other half existed in a filing office in Denver, and Douglas Hale could not reach Denver tonight. "I need to write the Denver freight office," she said, already moving toward the desk. "Tonight. I need certified copies of every delivery invoice to Mercer Ridge for the past 4 years, and I need that letter to leave this ranch without passing through a single hand that Douglas Hale put here." Mrs. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then the closed-door face opened, fully and without reservation, and what was behind it was fierce and decided and had apparently been waiting for a reason. "My boy Amos drives the buckboard to the depot on Thursdays," she said. "He's mine. No connection to Douglas Hale in any direction. He's carried my correspondence for 20 years and never lost a piece of it." She squared her shoulders, which were already square. "You write your letter, Miss Calloway. Amos will see it on the eastbound train himself, and I will be laying the fire in this room from this morning forward. If Silas Taft wants his duties back, he'll have to come through me." Nora looked at this iron-faced woman who had looked her up and down like something the cat dragged in on her first morning, and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd come up the mountain, the particular solidity of having an ally who had chosen to be one. "Mrs. Crane," she said, "why are you helping me?" The housekeeper's chin lifted. "Because I raised that man in the next room from a boy. I held him up at his wife's grave when his own legs wouldn't hold him, and for 3 years I have watched him die a little at a time in this big quiet house, and there was not one thing I could do about it." Her voice dropped but didn't soften. "You've been here 3 weeks. I've heard him laugh twice, real laughing, not the polite kind he does for company." Her eyes were wet, and she was furious about it. "So you catch your thief, Miss Calloway, but you understand what I'm telling you. It isn't only the thief I care about you catching." She left before Nora could answer. Nora wrote the letter. She wrote it with the care she brought to everything that mattered. Precise, complete, written in the plainest business language, requesting certified copies under seal. She addressed it to the regional freight office in Denver and sealed it and gave it to Amos Crane in the dark kitchen before dawn the next morning, and watched the buckboard roll out of the yard with 3 weeks of her case riding in a man's coat pocket. When Ethan came back from the North Camp at mid-morning, Nora took him into the study, closed the door, and told him everything. The missing receipts, Silas Taft, the letter already gone east, the second copy of the request she had asked Reverend Webb to post quietly from the Willow Creek Depot when she visited her father on Sunday, because she did not trust one road and she never had. She watched his face go through anger and then through something harder and quieter than anger. "You did all of that last night," he said, "alone, while I was at the camp. Mrs. Crane helped." "Mrs. Crane." Something crossed his face that was almost a smile, brief and complicated. "She warm up to you. She threatened to physically prevent Silas Taft from entering this room over a matter of fireplace maintenance." "Then you've done something in 3 weeks that no soul in 20 years has managed," he said, and the almost smile faded completely. "But listen to me." He came around the desk and stood closer than the conversation required, and his voice dropped to something low and serious. "This changed when it was columns in a ledger. That was one thing. But Hale has sent a man into this house to watch you, and he's already removed evidence, and now he knows you're a threat he can't dismiss. His jaw worked. You don't work this room alone after dark. Not once. Either I'm here or Mrs. Crane is here. That's not a request, Miss Calloway." Nora opened her mouth, and something in his face stopped her. It wasn't the rancher protecting his investment. It wasn't even the usual masculine presumption of deciding what was safe for a woman without consulting her. It was the face of a man who had stood at a grave in the autumn 3 years ago and had been braced against loss ever since, and was not willing to stand at another one. "I hear you," she said. He nodded once and stepped back and was Ethan Mercer again, contained, deliberate, forward-looking. "The copies from Denver. How long?" 3 weeks, perhaps 4. 3 weeks of Douglas Hale believing he's won." He looked at the shelf where the receipts had been. 3 weeks of him patting your hand and calling you a sweet, overwhelmed girl. "I've been playing harmless for this county my entire life," Nora said. "I can manage 3 more weeks." But Vivian Ashford was not idle in those 3 weeks, and neither was the town below. Nora learned how bad it had become on the Sunday she rode down to sit with her father. Henry Calloway looked better than he had in a year. The Denver doctor's new treatment was doing something measurable. His color improved, his breathing steadier. But his face, when she settled across the kitchen table from him, was troubled in a way that had nothing to do with his lungs. "There's talk," he said, and took her hand across the table. "Not the usual kind. Vivian Ashford has been in the mercantile and the churchyard and everywhere a body will listen, saying that you and Mercer." He couldn't finish it directly. She's saying it with that concerned face of hers, the one that makes every ugly thing sound like Christian worry. And folks that used to just whisper are saying it right out now because it's a rich man and a woman in a difficult position, and that's the kind of story people prefer to the truth. Nora felt the old cold move up her spine. She had been feeling it, one form or another, since she was 15 years old. "Pa, I have my own room. Mrs. Crane's room is next to mine. I work with the study door open half the time and the man's own housekeeper present." "I know that." Henry's eyes filled, "and you know that." But I've watched this town make a meal of you for years for the crime of being capable, and now they've found a better crime and they're glad of it." He pressed her hand. "I can't protect you from it, Nora. I never could, and it breaks me." Nora looked at her father's thin hand over hers and felt the steel in her go soft at the edges, the way it always did when the cruelty came at her through someone who loved her instead of directly. "Listen to me," she said, and made her voice fierce and low. "In 3 weeks I am going to catch a man who has been stealing from the most powerful ranch in this territory for the better part of a decade. A man that an entire operation full of people couldn't catch. And when I do, every soul in this county is going to understand that the woman they called worthless is the one who saw what no one else could see." She held his eyes. "Let them say what they want today. In a month they'll be calling me the sharpest mind in Colorado, and they'll hate that so much more, and I intend to enjoy every minute of it." Henry looked at his daughter, and through the tears he began slowly to laugh. "Your mother," he said. "God rest her. She would be so proud she'd burst." But riding back up the mountain that evening, her own fierce words felt thinner than they had at the kitchen table, because the truth she hadn't said to her father, the truth she had been carefully not saying to herself, was that the talk wasn't entirely wrong about everything. Nothing had happened. But something was there. She felt it every night across the lamplight, in the way Ethan passed her the ledger pages, his fingers close to hers, in the way he had started using her Christian name when Mrs. Crane wasn't in the room, in the way her own heart had quietly and without her permission stopped keeping to the columns sometime in the last 2 weeks. The town had convicted her of something that wasn't true yet. And the terrible part, the part she couldn't say to her father or to Mrs. Crane or hardly to herself, was that she had stopped being entirely certain she wanted it to stay untrue. She was still turning that over, uneasy and hopeful and a little ashamed of the hope, when she came up over the last rise and saw the Reverend's horse tied at the rail. Reverend Aldous Webb had ridden up the mountain alone. He was waiting on the porch when she arrived, turning his hat in his hands in the way she recognized from the day he had come to the store to question her virtue, except that this time his face was not uncomfortable in the same way. It was something heavier than discomfort. It was the face of a man carrying something he had been carrying for a long time and was not sure he should set down. He asked to speak with her privately. Ethan, who plainly did not like that request, stepped off the porch without argument and left them the study. The Reverend sat down. He did not speak for a moment. He turned his hat and looked at it as though it contained the beginning of whatever he had come to say. "The copies," Nora said. "From the Denver office. They came to you. They came 2 days past. I have them safe." He reached into his coat and his hand came out with 2 things. The first was the freight office packet she had been waiting for, thick, sealed, everything she needed to close the case against Douglas Hale. The second was a letter, older, the paper soft at the folds in the way of something carried and handled and carried again. The seal had been broken and repressed imperfectly. "This came to me as well," the Reverend said, "and it is this that has cost me 3 nights of sleep." Nora looked at the old letter. "What is it?" Reverend Webb's voice was very quiet. "It is from Catherine Mercer, written the winter she died. Left with me, her pastor, sealed, with instructions I was to give it to Ethan only when I judged the time to be right." He paused. "Or never, if the right time never came. The study was very still. For 3 years I kept it. There was no right time, because there was no one the letter seemed to concern. He was alone and grieving, and I could see no purpose in reopening a wound." His old eyes found hers. "And then you came up this mountain, Miss Calloway, and I started hearing about a bookkeeper who found what no one else could find. About a man who laughed again." He held the letter out to her, his hand not quite steady. 3 days ago I broke the seal. God forgive an old man his weakness. I could not give it or withhold it without knowing what it asked." Nora took the letter. Catherine Mercer's handwriting was clear and unhurried, the hand of a woman who had known exactly what she wanted to say and had taken the time to say it precisely. She read it, and when she finished, she sat very still for a long moment with the letter in her hands and the fire crackling in the grate, and the whole shape of the thing arranged itself in front of her with the terrible clarity of a column that adds up to an answer you didn't want. Catherine Mercer had written about Douglas Hale, by name. 3 years before Nora ever set foot on this mountain, the dead woman had described exactly what Hale was doing and exactly how he was doing it. And she had written that she had told Ethan 100 times, and Ethan had never believed her because Hale had carried his father's coffin and some loyalties ran deeper than evidence. And then Catherine had written one more thing. She had written that she did not want her husband to grieve her forever and grow old alone in a big empty house, calling his loneliness loyalty. She had written that she wanted him to find someone. Not a pretty face or a fine family. Those had been arriving with pies and marriageable daughters since before she was cold, and she had no patience for any of it. She wanted him to find a woman with a mind. A woman who would tell him the truth even when he didn't want to hear it. Who would read the books he avoided. Who would see the people he refused to see clearly. "Find the woman who tells you the number you don't want to hear," Catherine had written. "And when you find her, do not let the world's opinion or your own grief or your own pride talk you out of her." Nora sat with the letter in her hands. She could feel the Reverend watching her. She could feel the weight of what he had carried up this mountain and what he was asking her, without quite asking, to help him carry. He doesn't know this exists, she said. Ethan doesn't know she left it. She was afraid, the Reverend said. She wrote to me separately. She was afraid if he knew, he would remarry out of duty, find the first suitable woman to honor her wish, and be miserable in a room full of good intentions. She wanted him to find the right one first, of his own heart. And only then, did she want him to know she had blessed it. So he would never wonder if he was betraying her memory. She wanted him free first, comforted second. Nora looked at the letter for a long time. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and she held it out to Reverend Webb. "You can't give it to him," she said. "Not now." The Reverend went very still. "Not now, and maybe not for some time." Her voice was steady, though what it cost her to make it so was something she would only fully account for later, in private. "Reverend, think about what happens if he reads this tonight. With me still here, working at his desk. Every kind thing he has ever felt toward me. He will spend the rest of his life asking himself whether that was really him, or whether he was only following his dead wife's instructions." She looked up. "She wanted him free first. You said so yourself. If you give him that letter now, you don't free him. You give him an order in Catherine's handwriting and call it a blessing. And an order is not the same thing as love." She understood that. It's exactly why she left it with you instead of him. The study was quiet for a long time. Reverend Aldous Webb looked at the woman who had just refused the one thing that would have ended every doubt and silenced every ugly word the town had spent a month saying about her. He looked at her with the expression of a man watching something confirm itself that he had only half believed was possible. "Keep it," Nora said. She pressed the letter back into his hands. "Keep it sealed, and if there ever comes a day when Ethan Mercer chooses me freely, knowing nothing of this, wanting me because he wants me and not because a ghost instructed him, if that day comes, then you give it to him. It will be the finest gift of his life. He will know his own heart chose right and that the woman he loved first blessed the woman he loves now." She closed his hands around the letter, but not one day before. "Promise me." Reverend Webb bowed his head over the letter in his hands. "I promise it," he said. "God help me, I promise." Neither of them had thought to close the study door. And neither of them, in the weight of what had just passed between them, had thought to lower their voices at the last. On the porch where Ethan had left them their privacy, Vivian Ashford had been waiting for 20 minutes with her gloved hands folded and her lovely face composed and her ears very carefully open. She had come up the mountain again that morning without being invited, in her hired carriage, to press whatever advantage the previous visit had laid. She had been shown to the porch, and she had heard, not all of it, not the heart of it, not the part that would have told her what the letter actually said, but enough. Enough to know there was a letter from Catherine Mercer, enough to know the bookkeeper had read it, enough to know that a secret was being kept from Ethan deliberately by the plain girl from the supply store and the valley's own pastor, for reasons she could not quite hear clearly enough to understand. Vivian Ashford had spent her entire adult life understanding one thing with great precision: how to turn another person's private business into her own advantage. She smoothed her gloves. She arranged her expression into something warm and troubled and reluctant, the expression of a woman who has learned something terrible and is only now deciding whether she has the strength to share it. When Ethan came back around the house from the yard, she greeted him with exactly that face. She said nothing at all about what she had heard. And she rode back down the mountain with a secret she had half-heard and entirely misunderstood, and a plan that she was already building from it, stone by careful stone, the way a person builds the thing she wants from whatever the world happens to provide. The morning came in cold and clear, the kind of October morning that made the Colorado high country look like something painted rather than real. The aspens gone gold on the lower slopes, the sky above them a blue so deep it seemed to have weight. Nora was in the study before sunrise, the freight copies from Denver spread across the desk beside her own small-bound book, and the two of them together made something complete. Every figure, every crooked entry, every quarter year of Douglas Hale's careful thieving laid out in a chain so tight that no argument could find a gap in it. She had finished it late the night before and sat back and looked at it with the particular exhaustion of a person who has carried something heavy for a long distance and has finally set it down in the right place. Today, Ethan would ride for the sheriff in the county seat. She heard him in the yard before full light, the sound of a horse being saddled, the low exchange between him and the morning hand. She closed the bound book and set it in her satchel and carried the Denver copies to the front room to give to him before he left. She was crossing the hallway when Preston Doyle's horse came up the road at a pace that was not a social call. She heard him before she saw him, hooves on the hard-packed road, faster than they needed to be, the particular cadence of someone who is carrying news and knows the value of being first with it. He came into the yard and pulled up sharp, and his face, when she saw it through the window, was wearing an expression she recognized from the morning in the store. He looked the way he always looked when something had gone badly for someone he didn't like. Nora set her hand flat on the hallway wall and stood very still while the yard filled with the sound of Preston Doyle delivering whatever he had ridden up a mountain in the cold pre-dawn to deliver. and she understood before she could make out the words that Vivian Ashford had not spent the night idle. She was already moving toward the door when Ethan came in. His face told her before he spoke. "Is there a letter," he said, "from Catherine? Kept from me?" Nora looked at him across the entryway. She did not lie. She had never lied to him, not once, and she was not going to begin now in her own defense. "Yes," she said, "there is." She heard Preston Doyle's breath catch in the yard behind Ethan, the sharp intake of a man who has delivered his poison and is now watching it work. "The Reverend has it. He's had it 3 years, sealed, since before I ever came up this mountain." She kept her voice level. "3 days ago he brought it to me. I read it, and I told him to keep it from you." She made herself hold his eyes. "That part is true, Mr. Mercer. Every word of it. If you want to be angry with me for it, be angry with me for the true thing and not for what that woman is selling in town." The morning light was hard and gray in the entryway, and Ethan's face in it was unreadable in the way it had been in the store the first morning. Contained, deliberate, giving nothing away before he was ready. "Why?" he said. One word, quiet as a closed door. And there it was, the question she could not answer without destroying the very thing she had sacrificed to protect. To tell him why was to tell him what the letter said. To tell him what the letter said was to put Catherine's prescription in his head and let him spend the rest of his life unable to separate his own heart from his dead wife's instructions. The exact harm she had bled to prevent. Preston Doyle answered for her from the yard. "Because it's about her," he said, loud enough to carry, bright with the pleasure of it. "That's why. Miss Ashford says the letter's a warning from your late wife about some scheming woman, and your bookkeeper buried it because she's the scheming woman it warns about. She's been hiding Mrs. Mercer's own words from you, sir, so she could—" "That is a lie." Nora's voice came out like a struck match, sudden and sharp enough that Preston actually stopped. "That is a lie, and the woman who told it to you never read one word of that letter. If she had, she would have burned it rather than repeat it." Ethan looked at her. "What is in the letter?" She turned to him. She could see the war in him, the trust he had learned to give her fighting against the oldest and deepest wound he carried, the terror of being the man who believes too long, who trusts the wrong people because he cannot bear to think they would look him in the eye and lie. The flaw Catherine had loved him despite, the flaw Catherine had died worrying about. "I can't tell you," she said. "Can't or won't. The word came out rough. I won't tell you, Ethan. And I am asking you to trust me the way you told me you would, that morning in this house, when you said you would believe the numbers over the man, even if it broke your heart. I'm asking for that same word again. Not about a ledger. About me." His jaw worked. "Every soul who has ever kept something from me for my own good," he said slowly, "has said exactly that. My father, when the debts were worse than he let on. My foreman, the first bad year. Douglas Hale, 30 years of smiling and saying everything was fine." His voice had gone very quiet. "And every time, Nora, every time, the person keeping the secret said it was to protect me. And every time it cost me worse for the waiting." He looked at her and his eyes were terrible. "How is this different? Tell me how what you're asking me is different from every man who ever decided I couldn't handle the truth. It landed the way the truth lands when it's been thrown hard and aimed well." Because he was right. From where he stood, it looked exactly the same. And she had no way to prove it was the opposite without committing the very harm she had given up everything to prevent. "It's different," she said, and her voice broke along the edge of it, not from weakness, but from the force of what she was trying to carry across the distance between them. "Every one of those men kept the truth from you to protect themselves. Your father, your foreman, Douglas Hale, they hid things so you wouldn't blame them, so you'd keep trusting them, so they'd come out right on the other side of it." She steadied herself. "I am the only person who has ever kept something from you at my own cost. If I told you what was in that letter right now, it would help me. It would end every piece of ugly talk this county has spent a month manufacturing. It would put me in this house and shame Vivian Ashford into the ground and settle every doubt anyone has ever had about whether you should want me here." The tears came and she let them. "The truth would save me, Ethan, and I am choosing not to tell it, because telling it would cost you something worse than anything it would cost me. That is how it's different. Every man before me kept silent to save himself. I'm keeping silent to save you." The entryway was absolutely still. Preston Doyle had stopped his horse at the edge of the yard and was watching with the careful attention of a man who senses the moment getting away from him. Ethan stood between the door and Nora, and she watched the war cross his face, and she watched it resolve, and she saw the moment it resolved in the wrong direction. Not from cruelty, not from distrust, but from the wound that ran so deep in him that even love hadn't reached the bottom of it yet. "My whole life," he said, "people have kept things from me for my own good. And every single time it cost me worse for the waiting." He looked at her and the rawness in his face was almost more than she could hold. "I am done letting people decide what I can bear to hear." He went past her toward the door. "Ethan." She followed him into the yard. "Please, not like this. Not in anger, not with him watching. Whatever you feel for me, if you read it now with his voice in your ears and hers behind it, you will ruin something you can never get back. Don't you understand what I'm—" "Let go of the horse, Nora." She hadn't realized she had caught his stirrup. She looked up at him on the horse, and his face was closed in the way it had been the first morning, before she had learned to read him. Before she had learned what lived behind the contained, deliberate exterior of Ethan Mercer and had made the mistake of caring about it, she let go. And Ethan Mercer wheeled his horse and rode down the mountain toward Willow Creek. And Preston Doyle wheeled his horse and went after him with the particular eagerness of a man who has arranged a show and wants the best seat for it. The dust settled. Nora stood in the empty yard and understood what losing felt like when you had done everything right. "Miss Calloway," Mrs. Crane's voice from the porch, sharp and without any softness in it, which was somehow what she needed more than anything gentle could have been. "Get your coat. Amos has the buckboard hitched." Nora turned. The housekeeper was already tying her bonnet, her movements brisk and certain, her expression the one she wore when she had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. "Mrs. Crane, Amos," the housekeeper raised her toward the barn. "We're ready." To Nora, "You think I'm going to stand in this yard while Vivian Ashford and Preston Doyle tell the Reverend's story first? Let Ethan stand there with their version already poured in his ears, reading his wife's letter alone, surrounded by the entire town and whatever face they've put on it." She was already moving toward the buckboard. "No, ma'am. If that man is going to read Catherine's letter today, he is going to read it with the two women who love him most standing in that room. And he is going to hear the truth of it from people who were there." Amos Crane, his arm still in its splint from the buckboard accident, came out of the barn with the reins in his good hand and his jaw set in the expression of a man who intends to drive and is not going to be argued out of it. Nora got her coat. They came down the mountain fast, Amos handling the horses with the economy of long practice, the buckboard swaying on the curves, the cold morning air sharp against Nora's face. She sat with her satchel in her lap, the bound book inside it, the Denver copies beside it, and she thought about the bluff she was going to have to run, and whether she had the nerve for it, and understood that she did not have any choice about the nerve, because the alternative was watching Douglas Hale walk free for what he had done to Amos and to the truth and to 4 years of Ethan's life. They reached Willow Creek to find half the town already gathered in the churchyard. News in a small valley travels the way water travels, finding every low place, filling every available channel, arriving well ahead of the people it concerns. The story Vivian Ashford had built from a half-heard conversation had moved from house to house through the morning, collecting additions and interpretations at each stop, so that by the time Nora's buckboard reached the edge of town, the version circulating had grown considerably beyond anything Vivian had actually said. Vivian herself stood on the church steps in a deep green traveling dress, her expression arranged into something sorrowful and reluctant, the face of a woman who hates to be the bearer of hard news but loves you too much to stay silent. Around her, Willow Creek had assembled itself into an audience without appearing to do so, the way small towns do when they sense something worth watching. Reverend Webb stood in the church doorway with the worn letter in his hands. Ethan stood at the foot of the steps, and Preston Doyle stood to one side with his arms crossed, looking deeply satisfied. "Ethan," Vivian's voice carried across the churchyard, warm and grieved and precisely calibrated. "I take no pleasure in any of this. God knows I don't. But you had a right to your own wife's words, and that woman," she did not look at Nora arriving at the edge of the crowd. "She didn't need to. That woman conspired with your pastor to keep them from you. Read it. Read what Catherine tried to tell you and see who you allowed into your home." The crowd murmured. Hungry, attentive, leaning slightly forward the way crowds lean when they believe something is about to confirm what they already think. Nora pushed through. She moved through the press of people who had been deciding things about her for years, who had laughed behind their gloves and whispered behind their hands and said at every opportunity that she was too much in some ways and not enough in others. And she walked to the center of that churchyard, and she called across it in a voice that stopped the murmuring coal. "Reverend Webb, before you hand him that letter, tell these people one thing. Tell them who asked you to keep it, and tell them why." The Reverend looked up from the letter in his hands. He was a man who had married and buried this valley for 40 years, who had stood at the bedsides of the dying and the font of the newly baptized, and had held the private sorrow of 3 generations. He looked at Nora in the center of the churchyard, and he drew himself up on the church steps, and he spoke in the voice he used for things that mattered. The yard went silent. "I will tell them," he said. "I'll tell them gladly, for I have carried it 3 days, and it has nearly broken me." He looked out over the gathered faces. "Yes, there is a letter from Catherine Mercer, written the winter she died, left in my keeping, sealed for 3 years, and yes, 3 days ago I broke that seal because I could not bear the weight of it alone, and I took it up the mountain to Nora Calloway." His voice rang steady and clear across the churchyard. "And do you know what that woman did? The woman you have spent a month calling a schemer, the woman you threw away for years for the crime of being capable? Do you know what she did when I offered to give her the one thing that would have silenced every word you've said about her?" He held the letter up. "She refused it. She looked me in the eye and she told me to keep it hidden from Ethan Mercer, at her own cost, knowing it would leave her defenseless against exactly this, against this crowd, against that woman's version of events, against every ugly thing you are all so ready to believe." Someone in the crowd said, "Why?" A woman's voice, genuine, not hostile. Ask her, the Reverend said. She is standing right there. The woman you've spent a month calling every name but her own. Ask her why she gave up the one thing that would have saved her. And the whole of Willow Creek turned slowly to look at Nora Calloway. She stood among them in her working dress with her coat buttoned against the cold, her chin at the level it had been the morning she rode up the mountain. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Ethan, who was looking back at her with an expression that had begun slowly to crack open. Because of what's in it, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the way quiet voices carry in true silence. I'll tell you all now, since it's come to this, though I would have died before I said it 3 days ago. She held Ethan's eyes across the yard. Catherine Mercer didn't write that letter to warn her husband away from any woman. She wrote it to save him. She knew him better than he knew himself. She knew he had one flaw, that he trusted the people he loved too completely to ever look closely at what they were doing. And so he got robbed by men who smiled at him and he never saw it coming. A ripple moved through the crowd. She named Douglas Hale in that letter, by name. 3 years before I ever set foot on that mountain, Catherine Mercer described exactly what Hale was doing and exactly how, and no one believed her while she lived, and she knew no one would. Nora's voice shook, not with fear, but with the effort of saying something this costly in front of this many people. So she wrote it down and left it, hoping the proof would come someday. And it came. I found it in the ledgers, and the certified copies that prove it are in this satchel right now. The crowd made a sound, a collective involuntary intake, the sound of a story turning under everyone's feet. Ethan had gone the color of chalk, and then she wrote one more thing. Nora made herself go on because she had come too far to stop. She wrote that she did not want her husband to grieve her forever and die alone in that house. She forbade it. She told him to find someone else, but not a pretty face. Not a fine family. Not one of the women who would come calling with pies and daughters the moment she was gone. She looked at Vivian on the church steps, and Vivian's gracious face had begun very slightly to falter. She told him to find a woman with a mind, a woman who would tell him the hard truth, who would read the books he wouldn't read, who would see the people he refused to see clearly. And she told him when he found her, not to let the world's opinion or his own grief or his own pride talk him out of her. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman had begun to cry, quiet and private, not for show. That is what's in the letter, Nora said. That is the secret I hid. Catherine Mercer, dying, described the exact woman she prayed her husband would someday find, and when the Reverend showed it to me, I saw what everyone standing here can see now, that it fit me, line by line. It fit me. She pressed on through the thing it cost her. And that is exactly why I couldn't let Ethan read it. If he read his dead wife asking him to find a woman like me, while I was standing right there in his house, he would never know his own heart again. Every time he looked at me, for the rest of his life, he would wonder, did he choose me? Or did he follow Catherine's instructions? The tears came and she did not try to stop them. She wanted him free first. She said so herself. She wanted him to find the right woman of his own heart, and only then to know she had blessed it. If that letter reaches him today with Vivian Ashford's version already in his ears and half this town watching, it doesn't free him. It gives him an order in a dead woman's handwriting and calls it love. The churchyard was absolutely silent. Not the silence of a crowd waiting for something. The silence of a crowd that has been stopped. Vivian Ashford stood on the church steps and understood, in the space of the last 30 seconds, exactly what she had done. She had taken a letter that was this woman's greatest sacrifice and told the valley it was her greatest crime. She had built a scandal on an act of pure love and stood here in her green dress to preside over it. And the whole thing had just turned completely around, and she was standing on the wrong side of it in front of everyone she had come home to impress. She's twisting it, Vivian said, but her voice had lost its music. Ethan, you can't possibly. Reverend. Ethan's voice crossed the yard and stopped everything. He had not moved. He had been standing at the foot of the steps this whole time, perfectly still, and his face had gone through things that Nora had watched from across the yard and had not been able to name. Shock, and then the long process of a man rearranging what he thought he understood, and then something that looked, from 20 feet away, like a man finally seeing himself clearly for the first time in years. Is it true, he said. Every word she just said. Is that what's in Catherine's letter? Reverend Aldous Webb looked down at the worn paper in his hands. Word for word, he said quietly. She didn't miss a line. She could not have told it more truly if she had written it herself. He held the letter out. It belongs to you, Ethan. It always did. Read it now if you need to. But I will tell you this. That woman standing there just gave you every word of it, at the price of her own reputation, when staying silent would have cost her nothing but you. He paused. I have been a pastor for 40 years. I have never in all that time witnessed a truer act of love, and I have performed more than 500 marriages. Ethan took the letter from the Reverend's hands. The whole of Willow Creek watched him unfold it, watched him read his dead wife's words with his own eyes in the morning cold, watched him find Douglas Hale's name where Nora had said it would be, watched him find the warning, watched him find the blessing, watched a man read a letter that arrived 3 years too late and understand, in the reading of it, everything it had cost the living woman across the yard to keep it from him. When he finished, he did not look up immediately. His hand holding the paper had begun to shake. When he raised his head, he looked at Nora, and there was nothing managed in his face anymore. The containment was gone. The deliberateness was gone. What was there instead was something steadier and more open than either of those things. A man who had been standing at the edge of something for a long time and had finally taken the step and found solid ground underfoot. "You were right," he said. His voice was wrecked at the edges. "If I had read this 3 days ago in anger with Doyle's voice behind me and her version in my ears, I would have married you to honor Catherine and spent the rest of my life not knowing if it was real." He came toward her across the yard and the crowd parted without discussion. "You saw that. You saw it clearer than I could, while you were the one paying the price of it, and you let this entire town say what it wanted rather than take the easy way." He stopped in front of her. "Catherine wrote to find the woman who would tell me the truth even when it cost her. And I rode down a mountain and found her, and she caught the thief my wife warned me about, and then she proved herself the one by throwing away her own name to keep me free to choose." His eyes were wet and he appeared entirely unaware of it. "I don't need that letter to tell me to choose you, Nora Calloway. I would have chosen you in that store the morning I walked in before I knew Catherine had written a single word. I chose you when you asked me why and wouldn't take yes for an answer. I have been choosing you every night across that desk for a month, and I did not have the sense to say so." His voice broke and steadied. "The letter doesn't make it real. It only tells me Catherine would be glad." He paused, jaw tight. "And I am sorry. I am sorry I got on that horse. I did the exact thing she spent her life warning me about. I let a smiling liar and my own wounded pride talk me out of the one person telling me the truth. Forgive me. I am asking it in front of this whole town that has wronged you, because you deserve to have the asking be as public as the wrong." The churchyard was so quiet the aspens on the hill behind it were audible, their leaves turning in a wind no one could feel at ground level. Nora looked at the man in front of her and felt the long ache of 27 years break open in her chest. Not painfully, but the way a window breaks open in a closed room, all at once and with an inrush of something that had been waiting on the other side of it for a long time. But she was still who she was, and who she was didn't take what was handed to her before she'd looked underneath it. "I forgive you," she said. "I forgave you before you reached the bottom of the hill. There is nothing to forgive a man for being the thing his wife loved him despite." She steadied herself. "But I need to say one thing in front of all of them, so it's true out loud and not just understood between us." She lifted her chin. "I will not be chosen because a dead woman blessed it. I will not be your second wife because your first one approved the arrangement from the grave. If you want me, you want me, for what I am standing here, the woman who read your books and told you the truth and will fight you in your own study when you're wrong. Not the woman in the letter. Me." She held his eyes. "So don't tell me Catherine would be glad. Tell me you're glad. Tell me you choose me, and mean only that with no ghost's hand on either of our shoulders." The yard was perfectly still. Ethan Mercer looked at her, and something settled into his face that was steadier than anything she had seen there before. Not the ease of the early evenings, not the awe of difficult moments, but something underneath both of those, finally visible. The look of a man who has found ground that will hold him for the rest of his life. "Nora Calloway," he said, loud enough for the last row to hear. "I choose you, not for Catherine, not to fill a chair or honor a letter or satisfy this county's need for a tidy ending. I choose you because you are the finest mind I have ever encountered, and the most honest heart, and because as I have been a dead man walking around a live man's property for 3 years, and you are the first thing in all that time that made me feel I was still alive." His voice did not waver. "I would rather have you telling me I'm wrong across that desk for the rest of my days than have any other woman in this world telling me I'm right. That is my own heart. Nobody's ghost. Marry me." And the last option said yes. The churchyard erupted, not in cheering exactly. Something more complicated than cheering. The sound a crowd makes when it has been shown itself clearly and doesn't entirely enjoy the view but cannot look away from it. Nora stood in the middle of it and for a moment closed her eyes and felt the whole long weight of it. The years behind the counter, the gloves over the laughing mouths, the whispers, the pity, the anger she had turned so long into something useful, and felt it lift, not all at once, but enough to breathe differently than she had in a very long time. Then Ethan turned to face the church steps, and his expression was not the expression he wore for her. "Vivienne." His voice was quiet and more final than loud would have been. "You took my wife's letter, which you never read, and built a lie from the shape of it. You used Catherine's dying words as a weapon against the woman Catherine prayed I would find." He shook his head once, slow. "You always did want the house more than the man. Catherine saw it when we were young. I see it now." He looked out over the crowd. "Go home, all of you. There's nothing more here worth watching." He looked at Preston Doyle on the edge of the crowd. Preston Doyle, who had been watching the morning's entertainment curdle into something considerably less enjoyable, met his eyes for approximately 2 seconds and found something in them that made him look away first. "And come tomorrow," Ethan said. "Anyone who wants to witness something that actually matters can ride to the county seat. I'm swearing out a warrant on Douglas Hale for 4 years of theft and for running Amos Crane off the Denver Road and leaving him for dead in a wash. Crimes that the woman you've spent a month slandering uncovered while you were busy calling her names. The name Douglas Hale went through the crowd like a cold wind through an open door because Douglas Hale was beloved in this valley. Douglas Hale had attended their christenings and lent them money at favorable rates and smiled at their children and remembered their wives' names and their fathers' ailments. The idea of Douglas Hale being anything other than what he presented was a rearrangement of the world they understood, and rearrangements of that kind take time to settle. And in the confusion of that rearrangement, in the moment when the crowd's attention turned inward on itself and the morning cracked open into something new, Nora saw what no one else was looking for. Preston Doyle slipping away from the church steps. Quiet, quick. Not toward his father's bank or toward his house, toward the north road, the road that led to Douglas Hale's property. She caught Ethan's sleeve. Doyle just went north, she said, low and fast. He's going to warn Hale, right now, before we can get to the sheriff. Ethan's head came around and he was already scanning the road where Preston had been. If Hale runs, he won't run, Nora said, and something cold moved through her as she said it, because she had been thinking like Douglas Hale for 6 weeks, and she knew what Hale would think when he heard that the girl bookkeeper had just stood in the churchyard and laid out his crimes in front of the whole valley. He won't run, Ethan. He'll go for the evidence. He knows the Denver copies exist now. He heard me say so in the churchyard. He knows where I work, and he knows the house is empty. She looked at him. Everything that can hang him is in your study right now, and there is no one on that ridge between him and it. They rode for the mountain the way the devil was already ahead of them, because he was. Ethan had Nora up behind him on his own horse because there was no time for anything else, and Mrs. Crane and Amos followed in the buckboard at the pace Amos's one good arm could manage, and behind them came a handful of the younger hands, the ones Nora had identified over 6 weeks as certainly not Hale's men, drawn along by the momentum of a morning that had not yet finished with them. The cold air came fast against Nora's face, and she held on and thought about the bluff she was going to have to run if they arrived too late to arrive first, and whether it was enough. She had built it in her mind on the ride down the mountain that morning, turning it over, testing its weight, looking for the places where it could fail. It was a thin thing as bluffs went, but Douglas Hale had spent 6 weeks being carefully, deliberately made to believe that Nora Calloway was always one step ahead of him. She was counting on those 6 weeks. When they came over the last rise and the house came into view, there was already a horse at the rail, lathered hard, ridden from the direction of the valley floor. Not Doyle's horse. Older, a gray she recognized. Hale had not waited for a warning. He had heard the noise from the churchyard, sound carried in the valley's cold air in ways that rewarded attention, and he had understood before Preston Doyle was halfway up the road what it meant and what he needed to do. The front door stood open. Ethan was off the horse before it stopped, and Nora was right behind him, and they went through the front door and down the hallway toward the study without speaking, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already understood between them. She caught his arm at the study door. He's armed. She said it barely above a whisper. And he has nothing left to lose, which is the only thing more dangerous than a man with something to protect. She looked up at him. Let me go in first. He still thinks of me as the frightened girl from the supply store. I have spent 6 weeks making sure he does. Let me use it one last time. Ethan's jaw was tight enough to crack stone. He wanted to put his shoulder through that door and take Douglas Hale apart with his hands, and every line of him said so, and Nora knew it. And she also knew that doing it that way would give Hale exactly the chaos he needed to make anything that happened in this room afterward difficult to prosecute cleanly. She pressed her hand flat against Ethan's chest. Once quick. For Amos, she said. We do it cold. He breathed out slowly, stepped back half a pace. She opened the door. Douglas Hale spun. The room was a wreck. Drawers pulled, boxes upended, 20 years of reorganized records scattered across the floor in a way that would have broken Nora's heart a week ago. He was standing over the desk with his hands full of papers and a pistol leveled and his white whiskers and his grandfather's eyes, and none of the warmth in any of it, the warmth entirely gone now, stripped away, and what was underneath it was an old wolf who had spent 30 years being patient and was now cornered at the end of it all. The pistol came up level with Nora's chest. She raised her hands and made them steady. Mr. Hale, she said, and she made her voice exactly what it had been that first day in this room, uncertain, soft, a little breathless. The girl playing helplessly among letters. Please, please, I don't. There's no need for. Don't. His voice shook, not with weakness, but with fury, and something under the fury that was. She recognized genuine grief. Don't you play the frightened lamb with me, girl. I patted your hand on that porch and you looked me in the eye and told me you thought it was highwaymen who ran Amos off the road. The gun didn't waver. You knew. The whole time. You sat across from me and smiled and you knew. Mr. Hale, where is it, the little book? The one in your own writing. He looked past her to Ethan in the doorway, and there was something in his face for Ethan that was not in it for her. Something old and complicated and ruined. The face of a man who understands too late exactly what he has destroyed. I've been through every inch of this room. It's not here. Neither are the Denver copies. Nora lowered her hands slowly. She stopped performing. No, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely different now. Not the frightened girl. Not the careful professional, but the thing underneath both of those that had been reading numbers since she was 9 years old and had never once looked away from a figure that didn't add up. The certified copies from the Denver freight office have been in the county sheriff's safe for 3 days, Mr. Hale. Signed and registered, under seal. She watched his eyes, and the bound record in my own hand was never in this house. Not after the morning I found that my shelves had been visited by someone who knew exactly which 3 receipts to take. I never kept the only proof in one place. I never have. She took a single step into the room. You rode up this mountain to burn a room that has been empty for 2 weeks. You drew a gun on a woman and confessed to it in front of a room full of witnesses. She indicated the doorway where Ethan stood, and behind him now Mrs. Crane, and behind her 2 of the younger hands, to stop evidence that has already been filed and registered and is entirely beyond your reach. It was a bluff. Every word of it was a bluff. The bound book was in the satchel on Ethan's horse at the rail outside, not 30 feet away. And the Denver copies were in the same satchel, and the sheriff had nothing because they had been going to the sheriff this very morning when Preston Doyle had ridden up the road and the whole morning had come undone. But Douglas Hale did not know that, and Douglas Hale had spent 6 weeks being carefully, deliberately made to believe that Nora Calloway was always one step ahead of him, that she planned in layers, that she kept nothing in one place, that when she seemed to have no card left to play, she had already played it somewhere else. She watched the bluff work, watched the calculation move through him, the rapid, terrible reckoning of a man deciding whether what he was holding a gun over was worth what holding it would cost him, watched him measure the distance between what he thought he knew and what he now feared was true, watched the answer arrive in his eyes and settle there. Amos Crane survived, she said quietly. You know that. He didn't die in that wash. That is the difference right now in this room between a prison sentence and a hanging, and the only way you move from one to the other is if you do something in this room that cannot be undone. She held his eyes. Put it down, mister.
Hale, it's over. It was over before you rode up here.
For a long, suspended moment, the room held its breath. Then Douglas Hale, 60 years old, 30 years a thief, and never once, when it truly came to it, a killer, let the gun sag toward the desk. He set it down with a care that was almost gentle, and he put his white-haired head in his hands, and he said, in a voice that had lost every warm, rolling, room-filling quality it had ever possessed, I never meant for the boy to be hurt. I told Silas Taft. I told him to take the letter, spook the horse, make it look like a fall on the road. I never said push him into a wash and leave him. He was supposed to. He stopped. It went wrong. It all went wrong the day you came up this mountain. Ethan was across the room before anyone had seen him move. He took Douglas Hale by the collar and he held him, and the shaking in his hands was not weakness, and Nora watched him master it, watched him do the hardest thing a man of his nature can do, which is to have on the sources of 30 years of betrayal and choose to wait for the law instead of his own anger. You carried my father's coffin, Ethan said. His voice was so quiet it was nearly nothing. I called you by your first name at his grave. I trusted you with everything I had because I could not stand to think a man would look me in the eye and lie. He shook his head very slowly. Catherine knew. Catherine knew 20 years ago, and I told her she was being unkind. My wife spent her life trying to tell me, and I wouldn't hear it, and she died still trying. He let go of Hale's collar and stepped back. You didn't just steal my money, Douglas. You made my wife spend her dying breath worrying about me. That is what I can't forgive. Douglas Hale had no answer for that. He sat in the chair with his head in his hands and said nothing more. The sheriff came that afternoon, properly sent for, properly arrived, with the procedural weight of the law behind him. He took Douglas Hale away in the back of a wagon, quiet and without drama, which was somehow more complete than anything louder would have been. He took Preston Doyle as well, who had ridden straight into the yard at Mercer Ridge an hour later, still convinced he was delivering a useful warning, and had ridden instead into an arrest for aiding a fugitive, a charge the sheriff applied without any particular sympathy for how Preston's morning had arranged itself. Silas Taft was found within the week 2 counties east and brought back to account for what had happened to Amos Crane on the Denver road. The satchel with the bound book and the Denver copies was retrieved from Ethan's horse at the rail and delivered to the sheriff's office the following morning, properly registered, properly sealed. The case, when it went before the territorial court 3 months later, was so thoroughly documented. Every figure locked to every other figure, every crooked entry cross-referenced against the freight office's own records, that the jury did not deliberate long enough to finish their coffee. Douglas Hale went to prison for the theft and for what had been done to Amos Crane on the Denver road. His property was seized by the court. The recovered funds, not everything, but most of it, more than enough, came back to Mercer Ridge. But that was still ahead. That afternoon, when the sheriff's wagon had gone down the road and the dust had settled, and the yard had gone quiet in a way it hadn't been since morning, Nora stood in the study amid the wreck of everything Hale had scattered across the floor. She stood there for a moment without moving, and then she started picking up the pages. Because the books still needed to be in order. They were her books now. She had built them. Leave it. Ethan came in behind her. I'll leave it in a minute. Nora. He said her name in the way he had been saying it for a week when Mrs. Crane wasn't in the room, differently than he said it to anyone else, in a register that had nothing professional in it. Leave the pages. She set them down on the desk. Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway, looked at both of them, standing in the middle of the scattered records, and said, "I believe I'll make supper," and withdrew with the decisive tact of a woman who has managed a household long enough to recognize a moment when she sees one and knows exactly when not to be in it. Ethan stood in front of her. "I said everything I needed to say in that churchyard," he said, "in front of everyone. But I want to say it again in here, where it's just us, where there's no audience and no performance and no one left to tell about it afterward." Nora waited. "I have been alone in this house for 3 years. And I told myself the loneliness was grief, and the grief was loyalty, and the loyalty was the best I could do. And I believed it, because it was easier than the alternative." He looked at her without the managed quality that had been in his face in public, without the containment. "And then you rode up that road on a borrowed horse with your hair pinned back like you were going to work, which you were, and you walked into that room and you looked at 20 years of chaos and you were glad. You were genuinely glad to see it because it was finally the size of you." Something moved in his expression. "I stood in that doorway the first evening and watched you work, and I thought, there she is." I did not say it out loud. I told myself it was an employer's satisfaction at having hired well. But that was not what it was, and I think I knew it wasn't. Nora's heart was very loud. "I choose you," he said quietly this time, without the whole valley listening. "Not because Catherine wrote it. Because when I walk into a room you're in, I feel like a man again instead of a caretaker of my own property. Because you push back. Because you told me the truth when it cost you more than it cost anyone else in this county. Because you are the only person in 3 years who has treated my mind like it was worth engaging and not just my acreage." He looked at her directly, without performance or management. "Marry me," my own heart asking, nobody else's. Nora Calloway, who had added every column to its honest sum her entire life and had always come out lower than she deserved, looked at Ethan Mercer in his wrecked study with the pages of the book she had set right scattered around them both. And she did the sum one last time. "Yes," she said. "Not because you're the most powerful man in Colorado. Not because $40 a month saved the store. Not because you stood up to Preston Doyle the morning I needed it, though I won't pretend that didn't matter." She looked at him without any performance either. "Yes, because you asked me why and listened to the answer. Yes, because when I told you hard truths you didn't want to hear, you believed them anyway. Yes, because you got on that horse in anger this morning and came back in humility and asked forgiveness in front of every person who ever wronged me, and you did it out loud, and you did not make me ask you for it." She met his eyes steadily. "That is the man I'm saying yes to, my own heart answering, nobody else's." He kissed her in the study where she had found the first crooked number, and outside the window the mountain went gold in the late afternoon light. The way it did this time of year when the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the whole valley below went briefly, brilliantly, completely itself. They were married in Willow Creek Church 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in December when the first real snow of the season had dusted the ridge white and the valley below lay quiet under a sky the color of old pewter. The whole town came. The Garrett women came, and Widow Grayson, and every person who had whispered behind their hands, and every person who had laughed in the store the morning Preston Doyle had said what he said. They came because shame is a powerful teacher when it arrives all at once for an entire community, and because Nora Calloway had proved herself in a churchyard in a way that did not permit comfortable forgetting. Reverend Aldous Webb married them, and before the vows, he did the one last thing he had been carrying in reserve for the right moment. He took from his coat the worn letter, Catherine Mercer's letter, soft at the folds, 3 years and a mountain's worth of carrying on it, and he placed it in Ethan's hands at the altar. "You chose freely," the old man said quietly, "for the two of them alone in the noise of the assembled church. Of your own heart, before you knew a word of what she wrote. I watched you do it, in anger and then in humility, both of them on the same morning, without any hand on your shoulder but your own." His eyes were wet and he didn't try to conceal it. "So now the time is right, exactly as she asked me to judge it. Read it together tonight. And know that the woman who loved you first blessed the woman who loves you now. There is no shadow anywhere in it, none at all." They read it that night by lamplight in the study where it had all begun. Ethan read his dead wife's handwriting and found every word Nora had told the churchyard confirmed. The warning about Hale, the description of the woman Catherine had prayed he would find, the fierce and loving instruction not to waste his life on loneliness when there was still living to do. And at the bottom of the letter, one line that Nora had not read aloud in the churchyard, because it was not for the town, it was for her. Catherine Mercer had written, "To the woman who finds this, whoever you are, whatever the world has said about you, know that I am glad of you. You are the friend I never got to meet, and I am glad of you." Nora wept. Not for being proven right, not for being vindicated in front of the people who had doubted her. She wept because a woman she would never meet had looked ahead into the future and seen her, and had been glad. The years were good to Mercer Ridge after that, and good to Willow Creek, though the town took some time to grow into the goodness. Nora did not become a lady of leisure because that was not who she was and never had been. She took the ranch's records, clean now, honest, every line accountable to every other, and she turned them into the finest set of agricultural books in the Colorado Territory. A fact that became known quietly among the ranching community and led to more work on her own terms for neighboring operations that needed the same clarity she had brought to Mercer Ridge. She took the funds recovered from Douglas Hale's estate and she built a building in Willow Creek, plain and well lit and full of books and slates and the smell of chalk and wood stove and possibility. Any child in the valley could come and learn their letters and their arithmetic, and no one was turned away for any reason. The teacher she hired to run it full-time was the best she could find, brought down from Denver at a salary that made the school board look at their own ledgers with renewed attention. She taught there herself 2 mornings a week for the rest of her life, arithmetic primarily, but also, without ever naming it as a subject, how to ask the hard question out loud. How to look at a number that doesn't move the way it should and refuse to pretend it does. How to stand in the middle of a room full of people who have decided something about you and say the true thing anyway, even when the true thing costs you. More than one girl sat in those benches who had been told she was too clever for her own good. More than one of them left knowing she was not. Henry Calloway walked his daughter down the aisle in December with lungs that moved freely for the first time in years on the Denver doctor's medicine, paid for by the wages she had earned on the mountain. He lived 11 more years. He danced at the christening of his first grandchild and held the second one while it was still new enough to smell like beginning. And he told Nora once, near his end, that the proudest day of his life had not been the wedding or the school or the recovery of the Mercer funds, though he was proud of all of those things and said so. The proudest day, he said, was the morning in the churchyard when she had stood in the middle of everyone who had ever wronged her and given up the one thing that would have saved her name, because giving it up was the right thing to do for someone she loved. Because that, he said, was when everyone finally saw what he had known since she was 9 years old and could add a column in her head before he'd finished writing it down, that she was the best of them. She had always been the best of them. Mrs. Cordelia Crane stayed at Mercer Ridge until she was too old to manage the stairs with any dignity, at which point Nora moved her room to the ground floor and managed the stairs on her behalf until the end, because Mrs. Crane had driven a buckboard down a mountain in the cold on a morning when Nora had lost everything and stood to lose more, and some debts are not the financial kind and do not get settled with money. Amos Crane's arm healed clean and straight. He drove the buckboard for another 30 years, and he never once let anyone in his presence suggest that the mistress of Mercer Ridge had not personally saved his life with a letter she had already made redundant before she sent it, because the redundancy, he always said, was precisely the point. That was who she was. That was the whole point of her. Vivian Ashford left the valley before the new year. No one marked the exact day of her departure. She was simply there, and then she was not, and the space she had occupied closed over behind her without ceremony or comment, the way still water closes over a stone. Preston Doyle spent 60 days in the county jail for his role in Hale's escape attempt, came out quieter than he had gone in, and in the years after was seen occasionally at the loading dock of the new school building in Willow Creek, hauling lumber under a contract he had bid for fairly and been awarded fairly, because Nora did not carry grudges into business. She paid him the same rate she paid everyone else. He never, in her hearing, made any reference to the morning in the store. She never made reference to it either. Some things are put down and not picked up again, and that is not weakness but wisdom. Ethan and Nora Mercer grew old on that mountain together, and the house that had rattled with one person's silence for 3 years filled up with the sound of an ongoing argument, not the damaging kind, but the kind that 2 people of strong and equal intelligence maintain across a lifetime of disagreeing productively about things that genuinely matter. He never made a significant decision about the ranch without asking what she thought. She never told him what he wanted to hear in preference to what was true. They fought sometimes, hard, occasionally. Over the management of the ranch in the lean years, over the money for the school when the school board decided they knew better than the woman who had funded it, over the right way to handle a situation involving a ranch hand that each of them saw differently, and both of them were partly right about. Every fight ended the same way, with him grateful that he had married someone who would not let him be a fool, and with her grateful that she had found someone worth being honest with, someone who could take the hard truth and hold it steady and use it rather than break against it. The people of Willow Creek told their story for 2 generations, the way valleys tell the stories of the things that happened in them and shaped them. Some told it as a romance, the rancher and the shopkeeper's daughter, love found where no one was looking for it. That version was popular and not untrue. Some told it as a mystery, the bookkeeper who caught the thief, the evidence hidden in 20 years of paper, the decoy letter, and the book that held the real proof. That version was accurate and also popular. But the ones who had been in the churchyard that December morning, who had watched Nora Calloway stand in the center of the people who had thrown her away and give up the one thing that would have saved her, those people told it differently. They told of a woman who had been called worthless in her own store and had not flinched, who had straightened her spine and looked her accuser in the eye and said the plainest, most dignified thing available to her. who had ridden up a mountain to do work no one else could do, and had done it without asking for anyone's belief in advance, who had been given a gift that would have ended all her trouble and had handed it back because it would have poisoned the very thing it was meant to bless. They told of a woman who had understood before most people understand anything, that being chosen conveniently is not the same as being chosen truly. That a man who chooses you because a ghost told him to is not really choosing you at all. That love given under instruction is not the same thing as love given freely, and that the difference matters more than anything the world can offer you in exchange for accepting the lesser version. And she had held out for the difference, at a cost that most people would not have paid, in front of an audience that was hoping she would fail. She had never been the last option. She had only ever been waiting for someone honest enough to see her plainly, and brave enough to say so out loud in front of everyone who had said otherwise. And when that person came, she had not let him choose her for the wrong reasons. She had made him choose her for the right ones. And she was right too. That was the whole of it. The woman they threw away became the woman they could not do without. And Nora Calloway, Nora Mercer, in the end, lived every remaining day of her life exactly as herself, seen clearly, chosen freely, made small for no one, ever again.